Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cloud Native Live, where we dive into the code behind Cloud Native. I'm Annie Talvasto, and I'm a CNCF ambassador as well as a senior product marketing manager at Camunda, and I will be your host tonight. So, every week we bring a new set of presenters to showcase how to work with cloud native technologies. They will build things, they will break things, and they will answer all of your questions. So, you can join us every Wednesday to watch live. And it's a fun thing that's happening within the cloud native sphere in general. There's two micro surveys going on that you can complete. There's one for contributors and one for WASM. So, and also this week we have Christopher here with us to talk about creating a paved road for security in Kubernetes operators. And as always, this is an official live stream of the CNCF, and as such, it is subject to the CNCF Code of Conduct. So please do not add anything to the chat or questions that would be in violation of that Code of Conduct. Basically, please be respectful of all of your fellow participants as well as presenters. And today we'll be taking most of the questions in the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat throughout the session as well, so we can get answers to them, all of them, towards the end of the session. But I'll hand it over to Christoph to kick off today's presentation.
Thank you. So hey everyone, my name is Christoph Stiefel and I'm working at KubeOps as a technical Kubernetes architect, and today I will talk about Kubernetes operators, like how they work, what are the risks if you use them, and how you could mitigate those risks. So essentially, Kubernetes operator is an extension of the Kubernetes API with some which is provided by custom resource definitions, which extends the capabilities of Kubernetes beyond its initial primitives. So there's a controller that reconciles those resources for you, utilizing all the magic that Kubernetes has. And a common use case for it could be solutions or applications. So you might have a database that you wish to update. You may want to drain the data out of it, or you may want to rehydrate it. And this is usually a very good pattern to use and try to keep your application in sync with your cluster. So introduce, we've talked about custom resource definitions and what they do, but they can basically be anything that you want them to be to run your cluster, to provide all the operational knowledge. So they also introduce a custom controller, which essentially gets deployed normally in a dedicated namespace with a dedicated service account. But this isn't mandatory, so you can leverage existing resources if you wish to, which is kind of a bit scary, but we'll go through that a little bit later. And then alongside all of that, you would like to do with the operator and how it's going to work. It could also introduce further Kubernetes resources and resolve those, but also extend further outside your cluster and actually start configuring cloud resources, which is quite scary stuff too. And last on the list, there are some logging and metrics as well, just to give you some observability. Now, what can go wrong? So from a key threats perspective, you have service accounts permissions. Now, operators are administrative tasks, and to do so, as you probably know, they're highly permissive, or certainly have highly permissive service accounts. So if the operator gets compromised, you can leverage those permissions to pretty much do quite a lot of stuff, getting close to cluster admin. And from a deployment of the actual controller itself, these can be a privileged container as well, just so they can access and reach the resources that they need to. And also they're just as susceptible as any other container or image to vulnerabilities or dependencies that would in it. But I think the biggest thing from a workload perspective in Kubernetes is the scope of an operator, because not only it could be just namespace bound to a specific namespace that you would want to resolve your resources of how you want to do your work, or you can go completely cluster-wide or even multi-cluster-wide if you wanted to, which again extends those permissions. But even further can be externally bound, so it can start resolving those kind of resources But any of those permissions, if the operator gets compromised, can really take an attack to an attacker. So let's have a look at what a common attack path may look like. Well, an attacker could steal some credentials and attain cluster access, and from there you could enumerate the parts. Maybe he notices that there's an operator in there, queued in it, and then maybe from there you want to start enumerating what the service accounts can do. Maybe the namespace is already in it. If it's in a dedicated one, maybe you want to use the kube system namespace. And basically from there you can leverage the cluster role bindings if it has those. Another malicious container into it. So for instance, in the kube system namespace, and then you start bit by bit, start taking over other resources with like a privileged container. But yeah, granted that there are a lot of ifs and buts and other controls that you can apply within there. So a more kind of stealthy kind of attack path that you could take is actually replacing some of the code for an operator within the image or inside like a registry. So that could be an internal registry with an angry deployer or employer, for example, and chain type of attack. Now, the functionality of operator will maybe remain the same, but what you could do then is install like a malicious sidecar, and that sidecar will then be deployed alongside other containers and then intercept the load of requests that come through to gather sensitive information, and that information you can transfer to an adversely controlled cloud provider or account, for example. Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that there are several CVEs you can find if you kind of run operator. They are not always just about the operator itself, so there are things that are deployed alongside the operator that affect it and how it's done. So you can see that with, for instance, the capsule proxy, essentially the vulnerability is within there because the proxy is running as cluster admin. It gives you cluster access, then further on to the operator and so forth. So, but yet it just gives you an idea that operators are also vulnerable and are not immune to this topic. So yeah, how bad is it? This is of the official operator hub, where all the operators there were reviewed for key threats like what are the service accounts permissions that were deployed, what security contexts have they got applied, are there any sensitive cluster role bindings, you know, like, and then are they deployed in a separate namespace? Now, this is for security context. Red is bad. So red is basically saying that for specific security context, there's nothing applied to an operator asset, but the purple ones are typically the opposite of what you want. So that is, if you have privilege escalation false, for example, you would be setting it to true. So that is kind of a bit scary, but at the same time, some operators sometimes have like accessing or setting up container storage interface, for instance, which could justify such settings. So next up are the cluster role permissions. There were a lot that had cluster role permissions. You can see that there are a few cluster admin or cluster admin equivalent. That is, I have access to every single resource and every single Kubernetes API object. And alongside that, surprisingly, about 10% of the operators have bind or escalate or impersonate cluster roles. So the breakdown of this would be like 90% of this have dedicated namespaces, which is really cool. The only issue is that 84% had cluster roles, which almost defeats the point completely of having dedicated namespaces somewhat. 7% had access to secrets, which we'll take a look at later. And 70% could execute into pods. 58% do not use security context at all, and only 10% drop Linux capabilities. So as you can see, you have to be careful from an external source and really have to kind of review if the settings and the resources matches your environment security guidelines. Yeah, so I guess now it's demo part. Let me just switch my windows. Right, so I have a basic Kubernetes cluster here with 3 master and 3 worker nodes. And for this example, let's just deploy the commonly used Nginx English control Helm. So just as it is configured out of the box, just copy that here like this. So it's deployed in default namespace, and as you might know, it's basically an operator with a pod or container, which we can see here. And alongside that, we have some custom resource definitions deployed here. There's also a service account and also a class role with certain other stuff bound to it. Now, there's a useful tool called Bad Robot from Control Plane IO, which I have already installed on my local machine. And it is basically a Kubernetes operator audit tool, you can say. It's analysis and can analysis YAML files or manifests for you and scans the configuration and gives you some indications in form of a score. How bad a specific configuration, like a cluster role or a certain security context permission is. So as an example, let's just scan the RBAC YAML file from the out-of-the-box Nginx Ingress controller deployment, which I have copied here. It looks like this. As you can see, there's a service account with a cluster role and other permissions to the resources and so on. And so we scan the YAML file, and as you can see there, there's a service account with right. It basically says the operator service account or the cluster role has permissions to read secrets in our namespaces with a score of -12, which is actually pretty bad. But to be honest, I'm not quite sure if this is actually needed in order to let the Ingress controller work as intended. But yeah, later. And another way to check that would be with a kubectl command. Just describe the cluster role, and here you could see, okay, we can read secrets, get list and watch them, or what you could do would be to use the kubectl authentication command and ask basically, can I get secrets as the service account of my Nginx pod, which should say yes, and we could do that in every namespace. So now let's assume that an attacker cited the Nginx operator container, and maybe his goal is to deploy a malicious pod or container from there. So an option could be that he finds out that he can read secrets with the Nginx service account and abuse it to use another service account with the secret, which then has permissions to deploy pods. So, for example, there are some basic default Kubernetes service accounts, especially in a kube system namespace, which have those rights. So maybe let's check them real quick. And for example, the replication controller, which is capable of deploying pods by default, as you might know. And again, we could check that with the kubectl auth command and say, can I create a pod with this service account? And it should say yes, and also in every namespace. Now we would have our target service account, so to say, we want to use as an attacker. And as I said, for this scenario, an attacker managed to get into the Nginx operator pod. So let's execute into it like this. And let's see what we have here. Of course, there's no kubectl, but we do have curl, and with the curl command, we are able to send requests to the Kubernetes API. Therefore, we will have to use the credentials from the Nginx service account to authenticate against the API server, but all that stuff is already mounted inside the container, so it should be under var run secrets Kubernetes IO and then service account. You could find it out just by describing the pod as well. But here we have all the stuff we need, like the certificate, our token, and the name of the namespace. So for the curl command, we would need some variables. Let me just it's like API server equals our basic Kubernetes default service and name of the service account, name of the namespace. Then we have our token and the certificate we would need. And our curl command would basically look like this. We want to get all the secrets from the kubesystem namespace and then just pipe it into the file in the temp directory because we have write permissions here. So let's see. Right, so now we have all the secrets and as you want to use replication control, maybe let's just grab it like this. And you have our secret for your application for the service account. With all the credentials, and now we want to use this to deploy our malicious pod. So first of all, we would take the certificate and decode it first because it's base64 encoded. And just resize my screen. Oh. That looks good. So once again. Yeah, maybe just save that in the file here. Then we say the new third variable is the certificate, we just encode it or decode it. And we come from the application controller service account. Like this. That's the sorry. And yeah, let me just copy that. Like this. So token is a new variable here. And let's see, for our curl command, we would want to use a JSON template file for our malicious pod. So let us copy that here. Like this. So this is basically a bad pod, as it says. It wants to be in a kubesystem namespace. It just leaves, but it permissions like privileged true and access to the root file system of the host, and also the host processes and so on. And now the curl command would look like this. Where we want to place this pod in the kubesystem namespace with the help of the template file. And this should deploy the pod in the kubesystem namespace. So let's see. Let me exit here and yeah, here it is, up and running. And typically, an attacker would place some kind of backdoor into that container. So let's execute that one too. So keep system namespace and see what we can do. So just a typo, sorry. Right, so now we're in the bad pot. Now we do have kubectl, we do have kernel, and let's see, can we become sudo? We can, and we should also be able to access the root file system with chroot / home. And yeah, now we are on the host machine on some worker node. Let's assume that maybe a developer has a kubeconfig file in his home directory like this. And it looks like we are cluster admin here. We have all the credentials we would need and also the IP of the so maybe just to verify that, you could say kubectl config get context and then just use this kubeconfig file we found. And indeed, we are Kubernetes admin, and we should probably be able to delete a node, for example. And you could also check that. And instead of a service account, we now use the kubeconfig file, which would say, yes, we can. So basically, an attacker now managed to take over the whole cluster, so to say. Right, let me jump back. So how do we start to secure an operator? This is essentially what the CNCF says for operator security. The first and quite big tribe here is about transparency and documentation. When you're it is essential that you define exactly what the thing is doing and what you're trying to achieve. So in that sense, you can then start breaking down what permissions you need, whether it needs to be externally soaked or so forth. So that's a very important thing for an operator to do. And finding that scope, so like cluster-wide, external, or namespace-wide. So cluster-wide, you have access to all resources that you need, external cloud resources, and then namespace. They try to basically restrict RBFC permissions as much as possible, and so only use it if it's necessary. So, and as we've seen from the operator hub, which doesn't contain all the operators on the planet, that is not true, and quite a lot of them were being set to class permissions. Thing to bear in mind, if you think is the operator does have access to external resources, and you're going to need to review that as well. And they say that, or they state that you should leverage SE-Linux, AppArmor, and CCOM profiles as well. Well known across the industry, and as always, scan for vulnerabilities and consider your supply chain security. So from prevention strategies point of perspective, maybe let's say you want to better, it is worth mentioning that as of operator SDK version 1.18.1 or higher, there are two default security contexts set by default, like run as non-root set to true and allow privilege escalation set to false. As part of the developer who has them removed, you kind of have to question that or question why somewhat. So it may be bound to the way the thing works, but I think you should really question that one. So my advice would be just to be explicit and be careful the resources you want to access and the APIs. So try not to do star permissions, try not to do core API star. That is just being quite lazy. So the only issue is that an operator might actually require that as part of it in order to work. Question that somewhat, especially when you get into around RBSC API, because that's where if you buy a star, then you start to define the escalate privileges. So last kind of a bit of advice is to start to work with the developers to scope out the operator, restricting the operator to the namespaces that it's supposed to have. But not only the namespace it's supposed to be, so also restrict it to what it can watch as well, just slightly different. And yeah, review the cluster permissions and make sure they're not overly permissive, and then also do the same stuff for Cloud AIM, and also make sure that role and not cluster role is defined if you only got a namespace operator. So restrictive way to secure operators in your cluster in general is shown here. Bear in mind that you would have to check and make sure the operator itself still works as intended afterwards. But in theory, it hardens your cluster security when using operators. So to make the payload in your cluster from operators, so payload or applications should be in a different namespace than the operator. There should be no payload in the operator namespace, and vice versa. And to further separate payload from the operator, you can use as well as pod security policies, or as of Kubernetes 1.24, I guess, the pod security admission feature. So that, for example, the operator is not allowed to create or deploy other pod security policies, etc., or network policies in its own namespace and no other. And as I have already mentioned, the service account for the operator should be as minimalistic as possible regarding its permissions as well. So if possible, the operator should only be able to deploy the payload in its intended namespace. Right, so let us jump back to the console. So our Nginx Ingress controller operator was deployed into the default namespace, as you might have noticed. And as I said, we want the operator namespace. So maybe let's first create that one. Just exit from here and say create namespace. Let's call it operator, and maybe let's redeploy the Nginx snapshot. First delete the old one. So the same thing again, but now in the operator namespace. And now let's try to create a network policy into the operator namespace as a first step to separate it from the workload or payload. And basically what we want at first is to deny all the traffic coming in and out, and afterwards whitelist only the necessary stuff. For whatever workload we will try to achieve. But for now, block the traffic like this. So we say deny all the ingress and egress in the operator namespace. So let me fly it quickly. And now it should already be possible for an attacker to read the secrets with the service account from the Nginx operator pod, as we've seen before. So let's execute that one again. Deploy. Yeah, yeah. Right. So now we will set our variables again like this before, and try to curl the system namespace. Right, and as you can see, we won't get any response here, and the network policy seems to work. And another way to separate or restrict its permissions would be to change cluster roles and cluster role bindings, maybe to role and role bindings bound to the operator namespace. So let's try that one. I already saved the cluster role binding and cluster role for the server and set it to role and role binding, so they are bound to the operator namespace. So they should look like this. It's just added a namespace in here for the role and the role binding, and that's basically it. So yeah, maybe just delete the cluster role binding and the cluster role like this, and create a new role and role bindings. And maybe we'll see for now. Yeah, maybe like this. Okay. And then we try the whole thing again. Set the variables and try the cur command. And as you can see, it says our service account is forbidden to read secrets in the Qt namespace. And now we should only be able to read the secrets in the operator namespace, since the role and role binding is bounded to this one. So this cur command with the operator namespace now should work, and yes, it does. We now see all these secrets from right. So the last option would be to deploy a pod security policy. Maybe let's have a quick look at one I've already prepared. Looks like this, and now this one restricts or denies almost anything, like privilege set false, host processes, and also the network is set false, one is non-root, is set to true, and so on. For this, it's just for demo purposes. I suppose the operator won't work as intended anymore. But let us just deploy that one. Like this. No, and to activate the pod security policy, we also would have to activate the feature itself on the master node, and therefore we have to edit the API server manifest file. Let me do that real quick. So we just add the feature in the permission plugin, like this, and maybe we start with it. So now it should be active, and let's get back to our old cluster role and cluster role binding. We'll delete the role and the role binding corresponding, and apply the old ones again. And I guess since we want to create the bad pod again, we would have to delete the old one. It's running already. Yeah, it could take some time, but let us move in a few seconds. Yeah, so we execute in the Nginx pod again, like this. Now we should be able to read the secrets again. Yeah, he will put it in the output file. So let's check that one real quick. And yeah, now we have the secrets again. So let's grab for the replication controller again. And yeah, do the same stuff we did before, like decoding the credentials. And pipe it to a file like this. Same for the token. -d. We say token equals that one, cert equals the file we've created. So, and I guess we have to recreate our badpod JSON template since it's missing, right? One. And now finally we can try to do the curl command again and try to create the badpod again. And so now as you can see, we get some logs saying that our pod security policy prevented from being deployed because of the security context settings that yeah, didn't match. So as you can see, there are many different ways to secure the usage of operators, especially when you combine them. So that's it for now. Thank you for your attention. If you have further questions, feel free to ask if you didn't already. But that's it for the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Absolutely lovely demo as well. Let's see. There was a few audience questions / comments that we can take right now. But while we take those questions, now is the time to ask questions, as mentioned here. So type those away and we'll get them answered. So there was a question essentially on, will these YAML and JSON files be shared on GitHub? So people maybe want to try things themselves out.
I guess it would be possible. I can check that and contact you. I don't know how to publish them.
Yeah, we have a Cloud Native Slack channel within the CNCF Slack. So if you decide to do them, you can plug them in, for example, there. And that's gonna be great, for example, and the audience members can find it from there. And then the other comment is, for example, it goes, settings such as must run as non-root and privileged escalation, false etc. can be set in pod security policies community standpoint.
I guess he answered his own question. No.
Yeah,
he
said forgot to mention.
It was mentioned afterwards, I think, after he yeah, had that question.
Yeah, all good. Then that went well on that front as well. But yeah, those were the two questions we got during the session. But let's see if we have any more. So please, audience members, type them away. But I have a question meanwhile. Is there any kind of learn more resources, if anyone wants to dive even deeper into this topic, that you could recommend?
Yeah, maybe the or the special interest group for operators itself. If you have time for it, it's really big. But I can give you the link. It should be in some slides. This one, I guess.
Perfect. We can find it from there. Yeah, lovely. Yeah, let's see. No new questions so far. Then actually another question from me. Do you have, I always love asking this question, by the way. So do you have any predictions on this space? What's going to happen in the future? What will be the next steps for this?
Good question. I guess it would be of surprised what happens next. There's a lot of movement in there. I guess the more application or developing applications are used in general and in real production environments, the more this topic will become yeah, the topic itself will become bigger and bigger. And I think the awareness of security will also grow with it. So I guess there will be some interesting stuff coming.
Perfect. Sounds good. And let's see, no audience questions, new ones so far. But so we will start wrapping up. So final call for those audience questions there. Do you have any final words or notes that you want to share?
No, I guess not. That's it.
Okay, perfect. Well, it's been absolutely lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining into the latest episode of Cloud Native Live. It was great to have a session about creating a paved road for security in Kubernetes operators. I really like the audience interaction. There was a lot of people saying hi in the chat as well. So hi to everyone as well. And as always, we bring you the latest cloud native code every Wednesday. So tune in the future as well. We have a really great sessions coming up in the future and in the coming weeks. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.